Hi guys, and welcome to your week 8 lecture. This is on dialogue, and we're going to be looking quite closely on Ernest Hemingway's short story, Hills Like White Elephants. So if you haven't had a look at that yet, it's only a few pages. I suggest that you just take a quick break from this video and go and do that now. And I don't think I need to tell you that dialogue means reported speech in prose. Let's start off looking at what dialogue isn't normally terribly effective at doing. It isn't really super when it's used to introduce characters at length, or to explain backstory or describe action. Again, it's not great at expressing emotion in the words characters say to each other, or exploring the thematic elements of the story that ought to really come into the plot. And it's not brilliant at communicating the plot's action to the reader. Now, I think you probably knew all this already, but it's just a matter of kind of formalizing it for yourselves as writers. And if you think about, especially, long speeches when the backstory is being conveyed in a conversation, it's Tolkien does it, but it's not absolutely brilliant, is it? It really slows things down. Another area that is often, new writers often do, is they think that the thematic elements of their story needs to come in the conversation between their characters, when actually the thematic elements of your story usually comes in the plot. So if you're wanting to write something about loss, then somebody needs to lose something. If you want to write something about betrayal, then somebody needs to betray someone else. Now, this might happen in the dialogue, which we'll talk about later, but the dialogue doesn't explain the action, which is, a killer move. Radio 4 used to have this amazing booklet for how not to write for radio, and it was called, "Is That Gun in Your Hand Loaded?" It's really awkward when you try to do that. So what is dialogue good at? It's very useful in illuminating the dynamics of a relationship, and that's probably its number one best use. It helps develop the reader's understanding of a character. That's useful too. And it can be part of the conflict or the action of the plot, and we'll look at that later. And it provides a good counterpoint or texture to the main narrative voice. And we're joined again by my dog today. Say hello, baby. Hello. Who's going to help us look at Hills Like White Elephants. Now, Hemingway's not known for writing very good female characters or illuminating anything about the female experience. And yet, this particular short story does that very, very well indeed. And I'd particularly like you to look right at the beginning for this idea of how dialogue can illuminate the dynamics of a relationship. Let's look right at the first page. There is a description of the setting and a description of the characters from the outside. This is all seen from the outside. There's no interiority here. It's all observed. And so the dialogue has to carry a big weight of the characterization. If you haven't quite got it, this is a story about a man convincing his girlfriend, who has become pregnant, that she wants an abortion. We start off with the first thing the girl says is, "What should we drink?" the girl asked. She had taken off her hat and put it on the table. And he doesn't really answer her. He says, "It's pretty hot." So he's asking her to make that decision for the both of them. Now, when we go on in this story and we see that he's continually asking her to bear the weight of the decision making in their relationship. But by saying it's pretty hot, he's saying he wants beer. And so she very obediently tries to make him happy, and she says, let's drink beer. And he says, dos cervezas. And the woman says, big ones. This is the woman that is serving them, and he says, yes, 2 big ones. Okay. He doesn't ask the girl. He's just going to have them drink quite a lot, all right? Because that's what he wants. And we learn later in their conversation that's what they do. So now the girl looks off the line of hills, and she remarks that they look like white elephants. And again, he just doesn't actually engage with her lead. He doesn't really answer her. He says, I've never seen one. And then she says, well, no, you wouldn't have. So she's getting fed up with him, and you can just see it in the dialogue. And then he says, well, I might have. Just because you say I wouldn't doesn't prove anything. The next thing that happens is that she tries to change the subject. She looks at the bead curtain and notices that they've painted something on it and asks what it says, because he has the upper hand here. He's the one that speaks Spanish and she doesn't. He explains that it's a drink, and she says, shall we try it? Hoping to make things better. But again, this whole, do we want it with water? He turns to her and says, with water? Now, he knows that she's never had it before and she doesn't know how to drink it. But he's still forcing that decision-making onto her. So by the time we're, into a page and a half, we know exactly what's going on between this couple. So the next thing in our list is developing the reader's understanding of a character. The argument that happens on the bottom of page 2 and going on to page 3, the little conflict about the girl not being enthusiastic enough about the anís de toros, the licorice of the bulls, is very illuminating of the man's character, or lack thereof. He is sulky, isn't he? He's just sulky. He's blaming her for her pregnancy. And we have to remember that this is before the oral contraceptive was developed, when contraceptive responsibility was more or less firmly on using condoms. There wasn't anything that the woman could take responsibility for on her own, or that he should, kind of consider her responsibility. And yet he's being exceedingly sulky and making things even more miserable than they are. So when she says it tastes like licorice, he says that's the way with everything. And so when she catches that herself and says, yeah, everything tastes of licorice, especially all the things you waited so long for, like absinthe. And then he kind of snaps at her and says, cut it out. And she says, you started it. I was being amused. I was having a fine time. And he says, well, let's try and have a fine time. Now, we learn later that his idea of having a fine time is probably getting pretty darn smashed. But she says, well, I was trying. I said the mountains looked like white elephants. Wasn't that bright? And he goes, yeah, that was bright. And she says, I want to try this new drink. That's all we do, isn't it? Look at things and try new drinks. And it's his chance to say, no, that's not what our relationship is about. But what he says is, I guess so. So he's not going to take any responsibility in kind of moving the conversation along. He's not going to take any responsibility for expressing something that's a little bit more hopeful about their future. He's not taking any responsibility at all. And we understand that perfectly, don't we, when we read this? Now, dialogue can also work as part of the action conflict of the plot. In this story, the plot is the conflict between the two characters. And since we're not, Hemingway is telling this completely from the outside of these two characters in an observational narrative voice, the conflict in the plot depends entirely on the conversation between the two characters. And that's really effective because there is a conflict here. And the way they're speaking to each other isn't going to help resolve that conflict, not really. What it does is it illuminates it, and we see the breakup, really, of this relationship happening at the table. And I don't know if any of you are Schitt's Creek fans. I presume that quite a few of you might be. But there's a moment towards the end of the last series when Alexis breaks up with Ted the vet. And they're in a booth at the cafe that Twyla runs. And they've come to the realization that they can't stay together, that they're going to have to split up. And then they hold each other's hands in silence. Now, earlier in the series, and I think series 1, I'm really sorry I binged this, Twyla breaks up in the same, and not Twyla, Alexis breaks up in the same booth with Mudd. And again, not a single word is spoken at the breakup. And they are holding hands, but just gradually she realizes that he is not going to be able to be there for her in any meaningful way, and that she has been dumped without him saying a word because he doesn't want to talk about his feelings. And both of these are very good examples of the same way that action and conflict can be expressed in dialogue. And of course, on the stage or in a film or a television series, that can even happen without words. It's a little bit harder in a story. Another way that dialogue can work very effectively is in providing a counterpoint or texture to the main narrative voice. And here I'd like you to have a look at the end of this story. When the man picks up the heavy bags and takes them around the station to the other tracks. And when he comes back, he stops and he leaves her out there and stops and has a drink at the bar on his own. And the narrative voice says, he drank in a niece at the bar and looked at the people. They were all waiting reasonably for the train. So the narrative voice is slid very close to his point of view. And it says they were all reasonable. So the girl's being completely unreasonable by realizing that things in their life need to change now that they've become pregnant. He went out through the bead curtain. She was sitting at the table and smiled at him. Right. Do you feel better? He asked. I feel fine, she said. There's nothing wrong with me. I feel fine. The contrast between her voice, and you can kind of hear the distress in it, even when it's just read like that. Even if you just read it word by word, you can feel it. And the kind of weary and finding her tiresome narrative voice provides a wonderfully sharp counterpoint, almost like a slice of lemon with an Anis del Toro. Now let's look at some of the things that can make writing dialogue really tricky. Things that make dialogue tricky, number one, is that characters are just really tempted to just talk and talk and talk and talk. And you'll notice especially that sometimes your characters will start talking about the coffee they're having, or saying hello a lot, or, asking after people's uncles and things like that. You just need to shut them up. So remember, when you're writing dialogue, to have a very good balance between what you show, in terms of real time, and what you kind of compress and tell. Things that make dialogue tricky, number two, is that we talk to different people differently. And the dialogue is always about a relationship, not an announcement. So every conversation is different, even with the same character. Now, I've got an illustration of this. I'm writing to you from my home, and my kitchen is kind of that way. And it's got a very dodgy extension off of it, which isn't insulated or heated very well. And in the winter, if the kitchen door is left open, the wind kind of blows under this door so much that it can put a candle out. It's just awful. Now, I've been married to my husband we've been together for 36 years. And we don't need to talk to each other anymore, And on an evening when we're sitting in here watching the telly, if my husband comes in from the kitchen and he hasn't closed the kitchen door, the wind will just kind of whistle under the living room door. He doesn't notice, he's forgotten again, and he sits down. And I look at him, and he looks at me, and he suddenly realizes that he's left the kitchen door open, but he's not going to get up and get it, right? He's not going to get it, because he sits over on this side, the window side of the room, and it's not that cold over here. So then I will get up, and I will leave, and I will shut the kitchen door, and I will come back and sit down. Right, and I do this with resentment, and emphasis. So here we are, the two of us, and we've had an argument, and neither one of us have said a word. So the way we talk to different people is different. If I was asking somebody who was staying with me, I would say, oh, I'm just going to shut the kitchen door because, there's a terrible draft. And I wouldn't be cross at all. But with my husband, I'm not even going to talk to him, and I'm furious. And here's number three, things that make dialogue tricky. Punctuation and paragraphing. I can't overestimate how important they are in dialogue. And to make the dialogue actually work, you've got to get these just right. So, look at the yellow style book, the kind of how to do English style books that come under your student pages for the department. That is an excellent, excellent style book. Learn how to punctuate dialogue correctly. And that gives you an incredible weapon in guiding the reader through your narrative. And the last thing that makes dialogue tricky is that we seldom say exactly what we think or express how we really feel in our conversations. And British people, I am looking at you. There is not a nation on earth quite as reluctant to to kind of expose themselves in conversation as you guys. So, think about how people really talk to each other and make sure that that your conversation reflects that. So having told you all the ways that dialogue can go wrong, I'm going to try to help you with some great ways to make dialogue go right. And the first thing is really useful for all your writing is to think about what every character wants from every scene, what every character is hoping to achieve. And from the conversation, it's very useful as well. Human beings are wanting machines. All of us want something all the time, every day. We are looking for something to happen new, something that we're going to change, something that we want to get, something that we want to make somebody else do. We wake up every morning with a bit of an agenda. We're very seldom completely content. So this will help all of your scenes, not just your dialogue, but particularly for dialogue. Sit down and think, okay, what does this character want to happen in this conversation? What are they hoping happens? And that's really useful because then you can start pushing the currents of who's getting what back and forth through the dialogue. This is a related point. Consider the balance of power between the speakers. And we see this really clearly in the Hemingway short story, that in that relationship, the man has a lot of the power, doesn't he? A lot of the power. And especially in the end when he, goes into the bar and just leaves her and then comes back and says, basically, are you going to be reasonable now? This next one's about ruthless editing. Cut every speech that doesn't forward the plot or the reader's understanding of the relationship and or character. So no matter how clever or witty it might read, if it's not actually doing anything in the story, just get rid of it. And remember that, like in real life, it's not about the actual words they exchange. It's about the relationship between the people speaking. And I hope you can remember when we were talking about characters' rights and about characters having their own agendas and their own desires. And that comes into play here as well. If you have made characters that feel really real to you, then you're going to make dialogue that feels a lot more real to the reader. And that's going to be very convincing, and it's going to give you another tool to tell your story. I hope this was interesting, and I'll talk to you soon.